Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our weekly seance in the cemetery. Some of you have read the book. First of all, I want to thank Rainy Day Books, our great local bookstore, Vivian and Roger. We are lucky at the library to frequently be able to partner with them. They have in the corner, the southeast corner, they have the books for sale, George Saunders books. There are many signed books already signed. At the end of his presentation, we'll do there'll be a Q&A, I assume, at the end, but we'll do a book signing up here on the stage, and people can line up on that side. And you can get your pre-signed book or have him sign the book up here. And then I want to mention a couple of upcoming programs that the library has. At the end of this month, on February 28th, at the Central Library downtown, we'll be unveiling the latest part of our website, our digital encyclopedia of regional history. As some of you will know, we've done the Civil War on the Western Borders, which has won a lot of awards from historical societies. And we're about to do the second part of it, which is Truman and the Pendergast era. The 20s and 30s in Kansas City, pretty exciting, when Kansas City was known as the most open city in the United States, and you can define open any way you want. But John Taylor from the University of Central Missouri is a historian we've worked with. We'll be talking about Truman and the Pendergast machine, and you'll get a first look at the website, which we're very excited about. And then next month I want to mention one program in particular as part of this ongoing series. We had about 600 people for the first, for Chuck Marohn. We're doing something called What Makes a Great City. And the first part of it is based on the Strong Towns movement. We'll have urban planner Joe Minicozzi, who is #1. If you go to him, watch him on YouTube, he is very, very funny. But he'll also tell you the secrets of economic growth in cities, which are not the secrets that are well known in Kansas City. Let's just say that. And that's in the first week of March. But tonight we're really honored to have George Saunders. He does some actually normal things, like teach at Syracuse. He's won Guggenheim and MacArthur Awards, and he thanks his sisters in his acknowledgments. It doesn't say in the mini bios at the back of his books what he teaches at Syracuse, but I'm guessing from his fiction that he teaches the nuclear physics of the future or the past. In Civil War land, in Bad Decline, he describes my personal favorite future, burn and learn, the fully stocked library where you call out the name of any book from your tanning bed. Yes, your tanning bed. And they are delivered by high school girls on roller skates. I like that because of those high school girls. Don't worry, don't worry, don't get nervous, because they probably don't need the same level of benefits that librarians with master's degrees do. But then I feel like now I've become a character in Saunders land. A crazy, utterly bizarre universe, a lot like ours, but developing as dreamlike parallel universe that turns out our aspirations and self-absorptions into improbable yet seemingly inevitable, brightly lit twilight zones of ironic death and destruction, or more gently, just plain ludicrous failure to communicate, though seemingly all the right words are used. There is a python slithering through his gardens of good and evil. Monty Python. Thank you. How can he do this so brilliantly that we are glued to the page to find out what disaster lurks for his fools and jesters? He thanks, and therefore I thank Esther Forbes. Now, if you're my age, and there may be a few of you out there who are that old, you'll remember her masterwork, Johnny Tremaine. Young George Saunders was given the book by his beloved sister Lynette, not a sister that he acknowledges in the books, but a Kansas girl nun sister. Kansas, of course, as regulars at the Kansas City Public Library know, well, everything comes back to Kansas ultimately. And he was given this book in the 3rd grade. He read it first because he was in love with Sister Lynette, and then because he was swept off his feet by the verve, I quote him, of overfull sentences where sweetness could also be bitterness, and thrill us as he feel compressed moments that burst when you read them. That is his description of Johnny Tremaine, of Esther Forbes's prose, but I would say it's a great description of George Saunders, the compressed moments that burst when you read them. And as he says, that is where the literary battle should be fought. But in his first novel, our new book, his first novel, Lincoln in the Bardo, he does something more. I was going to tell you that it has the flavor of Dante's Purgatory, and maybe also some of the transcendental flowing through Emerson's transparent eyeball, but I begin again to sound as honorably pretentious as one of the characters in his stories. So I'll just say that he takes us into the graveyard with Abraham Lincoln and his beloved son Willie, where there are a lot of Saunders characters and a lot of Saunders sentences. And when we and Honest Abe are finally released from the cemetery, you will understand how tragedy and comedy give light and darkness and maybe even some meaning to our pretensions in our own stories of life and death. Ladies and gentlemen, a great American writer, George Saunders.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay in the back? Are we okay? Oh, great. Thank you so much. Before I say another word, I just want to say thank you to all of you. It's really an amazing experience to come to a town for the second time in your life and have such a wonderful audience. And I can still remember not too long ago reading in Des Moines, actually, and going to the bookstore, and there were 5 people there. And 3 of them came up afterwards and said they were in the wrong place. They thought it was a Civil War book. So I will never stop being grateful for this. So thank you so very much. I appreciate it. I also want to thank Crosby for that beautiful introduction and the library for this great space. Roger and Vivian at the legendary Rainy Day Books. I love that store so much. I was telling Roger beforehand, this Lincoln book, there were moments of real doubt, where I thought I maybe just lost my mind. And in fact, at one time I called, I emailed Lemony Snicket, and I said, I think I'm either writing the best thing I ever wrote or a real career ender. And he said, don't forget, it could be both. But in that, in those moments, one of the things I want to do tonight is kind of an artistic confession. And one of the things you do in those moments is you just look for some kind of encouragement. And one of the things my mind would always involuntarily do is flit back to Rainy Day Books when I was on the 10th of December tour. And I don't remember much of the details, but the night was somehow wonderful enough that it became a kind of a decent motivation to finish this book so I could come back to Kansas City. So thank you so very much. Thank you. So when we did the hardcover tour, we did a kind of a choral reading of Lincoln. I don't have my chorus with me. And also, I thought, you come to a new town, you got a book about death and grief. No, read something nice. So I thought I'd just introduce with a little icebreaker reading from another story. And then I was looking at it in the hotel, and it's got death and grief. So, whatever. But it's ostensibly funny. I gather that Kansas City is a laughing town. Could be. I mean, if not, it's totally fine. I can either read this 10-minute ostensibly funny thing, or I have something off stage. It's 3 hours. It's a brief history of the legume. So you decide. So this is when my wife and I were first married. We had our daughters right away, and my wife was stuck in bed for 4.5 months both times. And we were broke, and so it was a really, I wouldn't say it was difficult, but it was sort of an interesting time. Terry Eagleton once said that capitalism plunders the sensuality of the body. That's what sort of was happening. We were tired and beat up. But during that time, I thought, your kids are little. This is the best time of your life. Don't let it, skip by you. Record something every day. So for about 6 days, I managed to keep a diary. And years later, I found it, and it was so sad and sweet because you could see I was tired, and everything was sort of under-indicated. I left off articles. If I had to say plus or equals, I would use the mathematical symbol. I was so tired, So years later, I decided to use that diction in a story called the Sempler Girl Diaries. So I'll read just a short bit, and this is a guy like that, a middle-aged guy, loving guy who's exhausted, and he's trying to keep a record for the future. So this is just a little incident that happens. September 30th. Sorry for silence. crazy thing happened this week. Monday, Todd Grassberger died. Future readers know Todd. Have I mentioned? Probably have not mentioned. Todd, not close friend, just work colleague. Todd and I had running joke I had never returned firewire I had borrowed. In fact, it was company firewire, not his. He knew. I knew he knew. It was just our joke. Day started out fine, beautiful Indian summer day. Fire drill in morning. Whole complex emptied into outdoor courtyard. Day so beautiful, no one minded. Everyone lounging on berms, urging caution. Fun to see people of different companies, like seeing members of different tribes. Nabromax equal nerds. Calculating temperature needed to destroy by fire entire complex. Urged equal design firm. Has many hippies, prettiest girls. Many urged folks lying on backs on berms, looking up at clouds. One guy playing small wood flute. When all clear sounded, everyone booed. All filed sadly back inside. Then at 2, word rippled through office. Todd, dead. Had heart attack at dry cleaner just now during lunch. All afternoon, no one working. Everyone stunned, milling around, trying to process fact that Todd equal dead. Under Todd's desk, a pair of hiking boots. Against one wall, walking stick Todd used to take on lunchtime walks in woods. Weird sun shower around 3. Linda Hurtney. It's like a final goodbye from Todd. Linda equal nut. Once claimed crow on ledge was reincarnation of her dead husband. Said she could tell by way crow's head was cocked disapprovingly at large lunch she was eating. Then storm over, parking lot glistening. All evening, found myself looking afresh at Pam, kids. Everything suddenly precious. Said prayer before dinner. Did not usually pray before dinner, but tonight held hands, prayed. Prayed we would be grateful for our good fortune, grateful for each other. Prayed we would remember that various ups, downs we may experience as family equal small bumps in road compared with this. Prayed for Todd, prayed for Todd's family. Just nights ago, Todd was in own house, doing whatever Todd did at night, taking change out of pockets, having a laugh with kids, petting dog, thinking of future, tossing dirty clothes in hamper. Where is Todd tonight? October 1st. Todd Grassberger funeral today at Ukrainian church downtown. Todd, apparently from humble roots. Priest equal long-haired guy in cassock. Sings, chants whole service in Ukrainian from memory. As he chants paces, cassock rope swings. Scary guy. Very intense. Sermon, why this surprising? Did you think you were going to live forever? Only difference between you, sitting there anticipating the rest of your day, and Todd, in coffin, bound for eternal home in cold earth, is heartbeat. Feel that, people? In your chest? That is thin line between you and grave. So why do you live like you are eternal? That foolish. You are fools. This scary? This not scary. This truth, this reality. Shouts, shall we wake up? Shall we? Everyone staring big-eyed at priest. Except usual congregants who seem to have heard all before. Priest goes on, which of us will die tonight? Do we think he's being facetious? That shows we are dopes. Any one of us could die tonight. Die right now. Suddenly come up short of breath, keel over in pew, be with Todd and earth in wink of eye. Suddenly from downstairs kitchen, smell of roast beef. Happy chatter from church ladies down in kitchen. Smell of roast beef plus sound of pots clanking, plates being set out, equal appealing. People shifting in pews due to amazing smell of beef. Todd's 2 brothers come to lectern, make tributes. Older brother, Todd sweet, Todd funny, Todd a powerful force in his life. We'll never forget wonder that was Todd. Younger brother, yes,
Todd, super strong person. Todd equal bull. Although Todd could be somewhat firm, Todd did younger brother much good in long run by teaching him how to stand up for self. That is to say, having been pushed around by Todd throughout entire childhood, nothing can now faze younger brother. i.e., no bully in outside world will ever be equal of Todd. But Todd's so great. Todd the best. Todd's so smart, so good looking. No wonder Todd's mom plus dad always treated him, younger brother, like afterthought. But Todd's so caring, so perceptive. Todd understood this, would sometimes console younger brother by saying that he, younger brother, was perfectly fine in own way. Often just before breaking pact they had made, Wednesday night being younger brother's night to borrow dad's car, thereby ruining younger brother's chance to see girl he really liked. Possible love of life. Girl he eventually lost to this dope from Selden. Dope whose own older brother, apparently more inclined than Todd to give his younger brother a decent shot at family car. Todd's younger brother, breathless, pauses at lectern, can't seem to stop self, plunges ahead, but Todd great. Todd's so great. Todd will surely be missed. Todd taught everyone in family an important lesson. Although a person might be strong, pushy, bellicose, ambitious, slightly blind to needs of others, still, that does not mean person not greatest, most amazing brother ever, who occasionally, as if to spite self, might suddenly, surprising all, do some reasonably thoughtful thing. Younger brother, seemingly perplexed by own tribute, then led away from lectern by scowling older brother, hissing something in undertone. Todd's widow approaches lectern, can't seem to speak. 3 little girls clinging to her skirt. Widow hands the microphone to smallest girl. Smallest girl, bye, Daddy. Lunch good, lunch beyond good. Funeral so sad, lunch equal heaven. Eat 3 roast beef sandwiches in row off paper plate. Outside, yellow tree blowing in wind. Single yellow leaf blows in through open basement window. Watch it come down, land near my shoe. Think, life beautiful. So glad I'm not dead. If, when I die, do not want Pam lonely. Want her to remarry, have full life. As long as new husband is nice guy, gentle guy, religious guy, very caring, plus good to kids. But kids not fooled. Kids prefer dead dad, i.e. me, to a religious guy. Pale, boring, religious guy with no oomph, who wears weird sweaters and is always a little sad due to cannot get boner, due to physical ailment. Death, very much on my mind tonight, future reader. Can it be true that I will die, that Pam, kids will die, is awful? Why were we put here so inclined to love when end of our story equal death? That harsh, that cruel, do not like. Note to self, try harder in all things to be better person. So I'll stop there with that. Thank you. I did, years ago, I had a driver in New York City who was taking me to different bookstores, and he was an older Polish guy, and he was kind of over-driving. He'd driven long enough, so had a sort of a Zen attitude about time and space. And but we were going to a bookstore, and he said, "Sir, you go now to do reading?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Little advice for you. Don't read too long." I was like, "Oh, you know my work." He said, "No, the people don't like, so we'll always do short readings." You never go to a literary reading and have people say, "I wish he'd gone longer. That was just too..." So I thought what I would do, what I've been thinking about a lot lately, I've really been traveling almost nonstop for the last year with this Lincoln book. A beautiful opportunity to be in our country at this crazy moment that we're in. So I find myself thinking a lot about art. What's it for? How's it doing? Is it helping us? So I thought I would just kind of talk through basically an honest discussion of how, at least in my case, writing gets made. Now, when I was a young writer in Syracuse, I came from a working class background, Chicago and then Amarillo, Texas. So I really, by the time I went to grad school, I think I'd met one writer in my life, and then got to Syracuse. And then we had this stream of visiting writers, and it was great. But what I notice is when writers talk about writing, they'll often say something like, well, what's your book about? Well, I was trying to do something about patriarchy and using falconry in 15th century Milan with a color scheme of red and chartreuse to indicate the classic, like, wow, I get to get a different job. Sorry about that. So I resolved at that point, if I ever had a chance to talk about process, I'd try to really just be honest, even if it was a little humiliating, which it kind of is, because my process is very, comically simple. Basically, when I was younger, I thought the writer's job was to kind of know his theme, his moral, ethical stance, and then very confidently wheel his manure truck full of ideas up to you, dear reader, and then blah, just drop it on you. And I actually tried to work that way for many years, and it didn't work. So what I do now is really simple. I will have usually 2 or 3 things going, or if the Lincoln book, I'll have a couple sections. Go into the room, and of course, your first impulse is just to avoid it entirely. So I have a guitar in the room, sit down with the guitar and kind of just glance at the writing. Hi, and eventually I'll kind of just look at it. Maybe I'll move to that chair. And at some point, the trick for me is honestly just to let my eye fall on the first paragraph. If you're a writer, you know that you have a very strong relation to language, strong opinions about it. So just to start reading is the first step. And for me, the whole trick is this. I'm trying to imagine that I've never seen the work before. I just picked it up off a bus seat or something, I'm just reading it. And then I imagine that there's kind of a meter in my head, just like the old stereo meters. Over here is P for positive, over there is N for negative. And as you're reading, you're doing this kind of almost meditative thing where you're reading it, trying to imitate a first-time reader, and part of your mind is also watching that needle. It's just, how are we doing? If it's up in the positive, great. You've got a bestseller. But if you're honest, every now and then you'll feel the needle drop into the negative zone a little bit. Now, this is a real crossroads moment for writers. When you're a beginning writer, you say, the needle drops, you say, oh no, I have to go to law school. I'm ruined. Stupid story, stupid me, I'm a loser, I'm terrible. What I found is over the years, what I've developed is an ability at that point to not despair about it. Just notice it. And then you actually turn to the story in a somewhat parental way, and you say, hello, story, I'm your writer. What seems to be the problem? And the story will always say, nothing, I'm good. This is supposed to be a boring section, And again, like a parent, you say, yeah, no, I don't, you can talk to me. What's wrong? Why did your needle drop? And if you persist gently enough, the story will eventually turn to you and say something like, well, it's boring. And then you say, oh, it is boring, isn't it? That's all right, And this whole thing is about the writer feeling the story is of her, but it's not her. You did a draft. It's not your complete identity as a writer. So you're willing to go into the text and see, why did this needle drop? The great Chicago writer Stuart Dybek had a beautiful way of saying this. He said, the story is always talking to you, and your job as a writer is to listen. So in other words, to pay attention to the meter inflections. So let's say that you're reading along, the meter drops. The best thing is if you can identify exactly where in the text that first started. Sometimes it's just something like, you say, the cat leapt onto the black table, the dark expanse, the ebony flatness. Now, my theory is that when I'm writing a book, I really do have you in mind, and I am trying to be totally respectful to you. I assume that you're as smart as I am, as worldly, as well-intentioned, everything. So when I do that 3-part description of the black table, I think slightly there, you feel that I'm not paying attention to you on the second and third description. You know what I mean? Just a slight, in a given phrase, you can detect a certain condescension. My theory is at that point, we move a little bit apart. I always imagine the reader and writer to be on one of those motorcycle sidecar deals. And in a perfect story, we are so close together through the whole story. You don't doubt me through the whole story. You know that I respect you. And then when I drive you off the cliff, you're like, well, you know. Now, in a bad story, the two parts of the thing are miles apart. And I go left, and you don't even hear about it. You know. So the whole process for me was to think, okay, how in the world can I make sure that the reader stays with me the whole way in this process of mutual respect? So one of the things you do is you actually learn to micro-examine every phrase to see if I've offended you at all, essentially. Now, this can get weird, and I'm a former, I guess there's no such thing as a former Catholic. Actually, you're always a Catholic. So I come equipped with an inner nun that is, you know, always with me. And most used to saying, like, Mr. Saunders, when are you going to get a real job? That's not really But one of the things that she does is to underscore the idea that efficiency in prose is a form of respect for your reader. So what I do a lot of is cutting. I do a lot of editing of my work. Now, we all think that, you know, every writer wants to find her voice. And we associate that with singing, you know. I'm going to just type this up, and my voice will infuse every phrase. Partly true, but I found actually, and this is, I would stand by this 100%, you can find your voice equally well by cutting, by reducing a sort of a banal sentence into something really rare and exquisite. Certainly how Hemingway did it, how Henry Green did it, how Isaac Babel did it, how Esther Forbes did it. So let me give you kind of a ridiculous, cartoonish example, which isn't quite as extreme as I would actually do it, but it's close. Let's say that I dash off. One day, Bob came into the living room and sat down on the blue couch. It's English. You know, I wouldn't want that sentence in my book. Something about it seemed a little common. So, but in other words, if I hit that sentence, the needle would drop. Okay, let's see what we can do about that. I apply my engineering mind to it. First of all, why do we need one day? Because if Bob sat on the couch, it's implied that it's one day. So we just easily lop that off. And we have Bob came into the room and sat down on the blue couch. We saved 2 words. Okay. You invoke Sister Mary, low self-esteem. Please help me. And she says, well, Mr. Saunders, why do you have to have down? It's implied he's going to sit on the couch. Okay, yes, we'll cut that out. Bob came into the room and sat on the blue couch. Why does he have to come into the room? If you sit on a couch, you're sort of in the room already. So we cut that out. Bob sat on the blue couch. It's getting kind of Hemingway-esque up in here, you know. Then you say, blue. Why does it have to be blue? That's sort of just a habitually generated adjective. Cut it. Bob sat on the couch. Ooh. And then you think, so what? And then you cut it. and you just have Bob. But you don't suck yet. You've just got Bob. So that's a little exaggerated, but not much. And I have taken 70-page things and cut them down to 20 and so on. But again, the idea is that if I'm being that conscientious to language, I'm being respectful of you. I'm saying we don't have to have anything that's implied or vague or ambiguous. And when you start cutting these things down, the text actually starts sounding more like you, paradoxically. So for me, this means also I'm trying to start a story with the smallest possible idea I can come up with. I have a very literal mind. Maybe because I was an engineering person and I didn't really read a lot of literature as a young person. But for me, if I can imagine a story in advance, it's always boring. You know, well, let's see, a story about a supermodel moves next door to this really ugly guy, and they get together. Ugh. You know, that's about as good as I can do. So one of the things I learned early on was I had to not plan stories at all, not have any idea about ethics or theme or any of that. And I found over the years there's a sort of little troika of 3 sort of mantra-type quotes that I like to refer to. And one is the great Donald Barthelme said, "The writer is that person who, embarking on her task, has no idea what to do." That's the first one. The second one is a poet named Gerald. Are there any kids in here? Can I swear? You mind? All right. I didn't hear anything. So Gerald Stern said, if you start out to write a poem about 2 dogs fucking, and you write a poem about 2 dogs fucking, then you wrote a poem about 2 dogs fucking. Think about it. But not too much. And then Einstein, ever the smarty pants, had the high version. He said, and this is amazing, he said, no worthy problem is ever solved in the plane of its original conception. So this means if you set out to write a story about A and then you do it, you've actually failed yourself and you failed the reader. So in this way of thinking about it, it means that the whole artistic process involves somehow or another, and every writer does it a different way, it involves writing yourself into a kind of a Houdini moment where you've gotten yourself at the bottom of the river in a coffin with your hands handcuffed, and you genuinely don't know how to get out of it. This is kind of the gold standard. Now, it's really hard to do, but this is, for me, I've had so many stories where I'd write about half of it and get stuck, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. I had one story, the story I just read from was a 14-year project where I got stuck at a certain point, and what I was doing was trying to solve the problem in the plane of its original conception. So you can't, as I found, you can't really will yourself out of this. You can have all the clever mantra at your disposal, but in the actual doing of it, it just takes a lot of sweat, actually, to try to work your way through the lame ideas. So in a sense, this is a version of that old thing, no surprise for the reader, no surprise for the writer. And the whole thing, I think, has to do with one's relation to the reader. Condescension is death. We just did, I teach at Syracuse, and we just read 650 applications for our graduate program for 6 spots. So the students that get in are awesome. But what you find when you're reading at that volume is any sense of condescension or pre-existing agenda deflects the needle. The minute you see that the writer thinks she knows what she's got to give and is sort of standing fixed on that point, your interest goes down. It's a bit like if you were on a date and you saw that the person you were with had index cards. You know, 7 o'clock, ask about her mother, you know. Now, why would we do that? It's exactly the same as in art. You do it because you're insecure on the date. You want it to come out beautifully, but you're not confident, so you give yourself a little bit of help. The problem is, with dating and with the story, that help is perceived as condescension on the part of the person across the table. So it's really a beautiful profession in the sense that no matter how long you've been doing it, I've been doing this for 20 years now, and I have a mess of a story at home that is stuck at page 6. And I knew what it was, and it said, I don't think you have a right to tell me what I am, sir. So back off, or I'm going to make you work on me for 14 years, you know. So it's a beautiful job to be in the position of trying to be professionally in relation to mystery, essentially. Now, I didn't always write this way. I grew up in Chicago, didn't know any writers, went to engineering school. A high school teacher intervened on my behalf and got me into the School of Mines. And I was so desperate not to flunk out, you know, and not dishonor him, that I powered through with my little 2.8 grade point average. Went to Asia, and partly because I loved Hemingway and I wanted to be Hemingway, but updated, like Hemingway 2.0. So I went to Asia and worked in the oil business. At one point, I thought it would be romantic to skinny dip in a Sumatran river. So I did that after a little drinking, perhaps. And I looked up, and there was a pipeline, an oil pipeline, and there were like 300 monkeys pooping down into the water in which I was swimming. And I thought, oh, I wonder if that's okay. There wasn't. And I got sick for 3 years. I got some kind of viral infection that nobody on either side could find. And at 26 or 27, I just felt about 90. If I slept 14 hours, I was kind of okay. Less than that, I had a sort of a hangover feeling. So it was actually, a beautiful experience in vulnerability and learning that youth is actually temporary, that good health is not to be taken for granted. So I quit that job and kind of beatnicked around the U.S. for a long time. Got admitted to the Syracuse program, went there, met my wife Paula, and in the romantic Syracuse ambiance, those of you who've been to Syracuse are laughing. We got married, or got engaged in 3 weeks. Had 2 kids, and as I said earlier, we were pretty broke. And I had, at this point, I got to go to a friend's wedding in Mexico. We pooled our money together, and I went by myself. And I came back from that wedding, and it was every young novelist's dream. There was a radical Catholic priest, was the priest, and there was a male model / surfer in the wedding party. and a guy who had just gotten out of Joliet State Prison, and it was exotic. And I came home and I actually said to my wife, honey, you're sitting on a gold mine. Just watch this. And then for the next year, I would stay up, go to work, help get the kids to bed, drink a pot of coffee, and if I was feeling particularly creative, a bottle of Boone's Farm, which, if you know what that is, I don't recommend it. And at the end of a year, I had this book, this 700-page book. And just to give you some idea of how wonderful it was called Boda De Eduardo, which I think means like Ed's wedding. But it was my novel. And by that time, I learned you had to say it that way, novel. It's my novel. And so I thought, no, 700 pages, I'm a minimalist. I spent another 6 months cutting it down to 300 tightly packed words, And then as writers do, I said to my wife, sweetie, I've got a little something here you might want to take a look at. I think you're going to be very pleased. And so she took it in the room, and I went to play with the kids. And I came back a couple minutes later just to see how she was doing, and looked in, and she was sitting like this. Because she knew what that had cost us as a family. I was kind of half there all the time. And as soon as she made that gesture, if you're a writer, you'll identify with this. As soon as she made that gesture, I went, yeah, that's a piece of shit. I'd known it all along. There's no verbs. I don't know, it was kind of a... And I'd been basically half asleep the whole time I wrote it. And so there followed a difficult 2 or 3 days. And I went to work at the tech writing company and had this breakthrough that led to this way of writing. It was simply this. I was supposed to be taking notes on a conference call, and it was so boring, and there was nothing going on. I didn't have to be there, and I started writing these little sort of quasi-pornographic Dr. Seuss rhymes. And then whenever I'd write them, I'd do an illustration on the next page and then flip it over. And I did this for about 2 hours. And at the end, and just really out of the corner of my eye, at the end I had about 20 or 25 pages of this stuff. Almost threw it out, and I just liked it. I liked it a little bit. So I brought it home, threw it on the kitchen table, and heard for the first time in about 7 years, writing related, laughter. My wife was laughing genuinely because these things were funny. And something in my head just switched at that point. And I think what had happened to me was, being a working class person, kind of thrust into the writing world, I was intimidated. And I thought, art must be that thing that you can't actually do. You can stand on your toes, and once every 2 weeks you can touch a little bit of art, So I had eliminated all humor from my stories. Now, my whole life, if I was intimidated, if I was awkward, if I was trying to seduce somebody, if I was trying to get out of trouble, I would always tell a joke. It's just a reflex, kind of a weakness, actually. When my first girlfriend broke up with me, she said, you're always joking. I want someone who's more serious. And I made a joke, But in these early stories, there was not a trace of humor. There was not a trace of my class origin, which really was the most, that was the most interesting thing that ever happened to me, was kind of trying to make a living in America. Nothing of that. No pop culture, although I, love it and was steeped in it from the time I was a kid. When I heard that laughter from my wife, a little switch got thrown, and I felt like I was, in an alley getting beat up. And you look down, and there's a bunch of kindergartners beating you up. Like, how can that be? And then you notice that both your hands are behind your back. And then you take, well, this is where the metaphor breaks down, but you take your hands out. So suddenly I thought, of course, if you're going to be a writer, you have to use everything that you have. You can't just be particular about which portions of yourself you bring forward. Flannery O'Connor said, a writer can choose what he writes, but he can't choose what he makes live. And that is a bitter lesson. We think we want to belong to this lineage and present these positive things about ourselves, but in fact, you have to use your whole personhood, even and maybe especially the parts that you're a little uncertain about. So in that moment, I just had this realization that I'd been sort of phoning it in a certain way. Went in the next day to work and wrote this really crazy, kind of funny story that was also, the other thing I realized is that I work best when I'm imagining being entertaining. Now, before this, I'd been smart. I was being smart. I was having themes, But as soon as I noticed my wife being entertained, something opened up in me. So now the new stories were meant to be entertaining. They were meant to be frank, funny, And also, I had abandoned any idea of having control over them. I didn't have any control over those sushi. I wasn't trying to control those cartoons at all. I was barely aware I was doing them. So I went in the next day and wrote this part of this story that would be later the first story in my book, my first book. Immediately when I sent it out, it started getting more response. It was clearly a better thing to do. So I tell my students at Syracuse that this, in MFA programs, we do a kind of incremental improvement. I read your story, I say, tell more about the mother, or I make a couple line edits. This was a case of a kind of catastrophic break where suddenly it's almost like I had a scrim up. And in my desperation, I was maybe at that point 32 or 33, just getting the idea that not only did the world not care if I was a writer, it kind of preferred that I wasn't. And then this thing, I kind of knocked the scrim over. So it was a wonderful moment. And when I started working in that mode, I had strong opinions. I was having fun for the first time. But it was a little disappointing. I had all these stories by Hemingway and Chekhov in mind, and these grand ambitions of joining them. It was like this was Hemingway Mountain was over here, and all my life I've been trying to walk up with Ernest and stand up there and be sort of Hemingway's, acolyte. And then you realize that you get up there and he's standing on about a 6-inch platform. And no matter how good you are, you're going to just come up to Ernie's armpit, So you're up there feeling a little bitter, and you think, what, I'm an idiot. What do I know? I know about class. I know about struggle for money. I know all this stuff. Why am I up here on this stupid mountain? This guy's father was a doctor. He had money. Forget you, Ernest. And you stomp down the hill, never doing that again. And then you look over, and there's Kerouac Mountain. You're like, hey, that's a working class guy. And off you go. You're up that one. And I think most writers do this. They imitate other writers repetitively until that beautiful, frightening moment when you realize that the things that we know in our life can't be expressed in someone else's voice. They can't be expressed in someone else's point of view. So you have to push off and find your own way to do it. So when I wrote this first story at work, and I really felt that, but it was a little disappointing. It was like I looked over and there was a little shit hill, with my name on it, with a Saunders. Really? That's all I get? But then, you kind of, you go and stand on it like, please, shit hill, rise. So I think we have to be the writers that our prose tells us we are. We might think we're this kind of writer. If the prose counterindicates, you can't do it. It's like if you were, you love Shostakovich and you wanted to write somber string quartets in C minor, but whenever you did that, the world nodded off. But whenever you picked up the accordion, people danced. And it sounds kind of fun in this context, but in real life, it's sometimes a bit bitter. But most people that I've seen hit that crossroads will choose to go the way of their own originality, even though it's a little difficult. So for me, at this point, here's what I think about a story or about art. It's basically, I have two models in mind. One is, it's like a roller coaster ride. I'm the person who designs the roller coaster ride. I don't really know what I want you to feel at the end. I don't want you to be thinking about late-stage capitalism, I just want you to go, God! I want you to just almost be speechless at the end from the velocity of the thing. Now, when we get off a roller coaster, we have that reaction, and then a couple minutes later, we'll start to analyze, oh, that third curve was the best, But I think what most artists and most readers want is that split second afterwards where you're sort of blasted out of yourself. I read an art critic who said everything meaningful in a work of art takes place in the first half second after your eye falls on it. That's a hard thing to learn because it puts you into a pretty scary territory. You are going to be the person who kicks ass with your roller coaster. And all the analysis and after-the-fact justification actually doesn't matter. The other model I like to think is just if there was a kind of a black box here, almost like a haunted house that we used to make as kids. My job is to go in there and fart around for a few years and arrange something. You come in, and as far as I would want to go is that you go in state of mind A, you come out in state of mind B. And the transform is not trivial, and there's an emotional component. So I don't really know how you're going to feel at the end of this book or this story, but I want you to be transformed in a non-trivial way. Turns out you can actually edit with that narrow focus in mind. At least I think you can. So it's all assuming that, this beautiful assumption that the human mind is not that difference between you and me. If I say fresh cut grass on a summer day, 1,000 minds just vibrated a little bit. Or if I say first kiss, so my neurons did something, the words went out, your neurons vibrated, which I think is a very optimistic sort of thing. The other thing I found is when I work on something for a long time in this state of kind of low concept mind, I actually become a better person. At this point in my life, this guy, I am so sick of him. I'm 59. I know every joke. I know every bit of neurosis. I know every mental habit. I know every nostalgic story. I'm over him. But when I'm writing, that dummy recedes, actually. He's still there, but there's something luminous and something kind of wonderful that comes out. The concepts turn off, and some kind of instinct comes on. So when I look at one of my stories, it's the result of me applying many, many selves to it over a very long time. And I like that person in the story, much more than I like this guy. Also, I think when a reader is reading, if I've done my job, she also kind of comes out of her everyday mind dressing a little bit. You know that feeling where suddenly you're you, but you're a better you. So in a perfect world, I come out, you come out, and this is a terrible metaphor, but like fish, you just kiss. I don't think fish actually do that, but this is the moment that we dream of, is that little thing. There's a sort of an improvement in the writer through successive revisions that I've never been able to understand, but I have definitely felt it. And I can give you a small example of what I mean. It has nothing to do with intending to be more empathetic or anything like that. It's just about trying to make the gods of fiction happy. Trying to make better sentences, trying to make sentences that are more specific. So let's say that for my first sentence of my next novel, I write this humdinger. Frank was an asshole. It's okay. It could be. But something about the gods of fiction don't like that. And they say, how so? You say, okay, Frank was an asshole because he spoke rudely to the young barista. Okay, now, the gods of fiction like specificity. They like, okay, and then they say, why do you think he did that? Okay, Frank spoke rudely to the young barista because she reminded him of his wife, dead wife. Now, we've done two things. One is I think we've made a more interesting English sentence. Frank spoke rudely to the young barista who reminded him of his dead wife, Marie. In the process, in basically two brushstrokes, we've taken Frank from, an asshole who basically is down here. The reader and writer are looking down at that asshole Frank. In two brushstrokes, Frank now is a guy who is so capable of love that when his wife died, he lost his ability to be kind to a young person. Now, is that compassion? I think it kind of is. In a sense, what fiction for the writer, and maybe for the reader, can be like empathy training wheels. In real life, time goes a little fast for me. I can't be as kind as I'd like to be, or, I come back from a weekend with a friend and think, oh, why didn't I say this? Or you see something happening in real time and you don't intervene. But in fiction, you can slow the time down. You can micro-examine your own reactions, and you can take Frank from someone who you would dismiss to someone who you would look at more closely. Now, is Frank still an asshole because he snapped at the barista? Yeah, probably, But think about the difference just in that small example of how we regard him. In the one case, he's not worthy of our consideration. In the second, we have both the first wave of dislike for him and a second wave of empathy. Very powerful. If you're like me, if somebody cuts you off in traffic, you immediately know what political party they belong to, which is the opposite of yours, of course. So to me, fiction, the lovely thing about fiction is it just gives you a mechanical way, much like prayer or meditation, to kind of soften your reaction to the world, make it more sympathetic. It doesn't mean you have to be a sucker about it. I still don't like Frank that much. And in fact, if I was standing behind Frank and I was a fictional character, I think I'd be inclined to tell him to knock it off. And that's where the story would get interesting. But it does give us a chance to root everything in specificity. And I'll just close by saying, I covered the Trump campaign for the New Yorker 2 years ago. And one of the things that I was really amazed by was when I had just finished this Lincoln book, I finished it, and then Trump came on the scene. When I was writing the book, my mind was I was so happy. My mind was really, it felt big, really comfortable with ambiguity, curious, kind of open. It was slow to judge. I was really happy to dig into characters very lovingly. And then when I got the assignment, then you have to sort of immerse yourself in the political moments. So I got on social media, I started watching cable news obsessively, and I just will make the scientific observation that my mind shrunk. I got pissy, I got agitated, combative, I was unhappy, I was picking fights with everybody. And I just thought, isn't that interesting that, of course, we all have different modalities. We think in different ways. But Art Mind was capacious. In Art Mind, I was patient and I was more loving, and I wasn't any less effective in the world. I was actually more effective. And I could just feel my mind shriek down. So to me, I'm thinking that at this moment, at least for me, I'm trying to keep my mind big. I'm trying, even though I'm a liberal, somewhat left of Gandhi, and I think we're in a national crisis, but I'm trying to tell myself that the way to be an effective force for good in the world is the fictive way, which is to say, my brain is not actually up to the challenges of the real world in its normal state. Through fictive methods, reading and writing, I can expand my empathy and my compassion, and I can actually be more effective. Now, for us, I'm assuming some progressives might be in the room, we have a tendency to equate that kind of empathy with something the Buddhists call idiot compassion. So somebody drives a spike through your head, and you say, "Oh, thank you for the coat rack," you know. That's not what I'm talking about. It's much more the idea that if you fully understand the opposition is humanized, and actually you can be a more effective persuader or resistor if you need to be. So that's kind of what I'm thinking anyway these days. I don't know how true it is. But in this sense, art is sort of an acted humility. And if and when you need to act, you act later and you act with more data. That's kind of the theory. So I'll pause there and take any questions that you have. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you. And I think the idea is you come down here if you have a question. I've been doing a lot of touring, and there's this weird Darwinian thing I've noticed, that the first person to ask a question always ends up having the highest sexual energy in the room. Congratulations, madam.
So I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about some of the artistic and structural choices you made in Lincoln and the Bardo. Like, why did you put it in those little snippets, and what were the reasons behind that?
Sure. You know, do you remember in Hemingway, there's something where someone says, "How did you go broke?" And the guy says, "Gradually and then all at once." I look back and I'm not quite sure. You know, I've noticed if I'm trying to answer that question honestly, I think artistic decisions happen kind of on 5 or 6 tracks at once. So with this one, the main thing was, I heard this story 20 years ago, that Lincoln had been so grief-stricken by the death of his son that he went into the crypt and held the body. And back then I thought, oh, that's a beautiful story for somebody. But I had just kind of figured out how to write a short story, and I was old. I was 33 or 34, old for a first story. And I was really clingy to that method. And it was funny, first person, kind of futuristic, and I just couldn't see any way that could be this Lincoln book. You know, when you're a writer, you do this kind of ventriloquism where you throw your voice out ahead, like, okay, I'm gonna tell this story, would that voice work? And with this one, I thought, okay, what would it be, Lincoln, first person? You know, 7 minutes ago, I did enter this graveyard. That seemed no good. Could it be like a grave digger who's stayed late or something? I don't know. So I just didn't find a way to do it. And many years before, I'd written a book set in a graveyard that had a chat line format. So that was on my mind. And then one of my students said, you know, I think if you ever wrote a novel, it would be in monologues. And again, something snapped in my head. So one day I just started writing in this theatrical form. And for me, the number one thing is if I feel like it's fun, then I keep doing it. And that form never stopped being fun until the last day. So I don't really have a simple answer for it, but it was kind of trial and error over many months. You know.
My daughter wrote a book report on Lincoln in the Bardo. And,
Thank you. I heard about that, yeah.
one of the requirements of the book report was that she note where in the novel there was foreshadowing. And I don't usually do my daughter's homework for her, but she was just having a terrible time writing any foreshadowing. So I said, okay, I read it. And we read that thing up and down and back and forth. No, not a single instance. And so I just kind of wanted to tell you that the English teachers of the world, they think you're doing it wrong.
I'll have to put some in next time, yeah.
To have the foreshadowing, but I don't know. I just, if you'd like to comment on that, I just.
Well, I wouldn't. I know. No, I will say I have a real aversion to. Well, I guess because foreshadowing would imply that I knew what was going to happen, and I really tried not to know too much. I knew that Lincoln would come to the graveyard and would eventually leave. I knew Willie would be there and was not supposed to be there and either would go to heaven or hell. That's all I knew. So I didn't really have anything to foreshadow with. But next time, I'm putting it in. It's going to be in, tell your daughter, paragraph 8. We're on.
Hi, I listened to Lincoln in the Bardo on Audible, and I just wanted to know how involved you were in that creative process, like did you want David Sedaris to be one of the, how did all that come together with all the voices, and how much choice did you have in that? Were you in a studio with people?
Yeah, that was a great surprise. I had done the audiobook for 10th of December and had a great time, and the same producer was slated to do this one. And I got to the end of the book, and I thought, oh my God, I have to read all those. I can do 3 voices. I can do a guy from Brooklyn, a Southern guy, and a duck. That's about the extent. And I thought, I do not want to read all those things. So I said to Kelly Gilday, can we get some help? And she said, well, let me see what I can do. It's, there's always money concerns. And she came back and she'd done a PowerPoint slide. And she said, well, if we wanted to do a separate voice for each individual in the book, we need 166 people. I'm like, can we get that? And she said, let me think about it. And somehow she kind of lit up. And so she called, and we had gotten Nick Offerman and David Sedaris to do the 2 parts. And that kind of opened the floodgates, and Susan Sarandon said yes, and Ben Stiller, and it was Keegan-Michael Key, and it was really exciting. And I thought, oh, great. How many more do we need? 140. So then we went to Random House, and my agent, a bunch of young people volunteered. Great. How many do you need? 80. So then we my mom's on there, my dad's on there, my sisters, my kids, my wife, the 2 teachers that got me into high school, and the very last person that agreed was Ben Stiller, actually, and we had 166. So I didn't, my job was basically to just go, that's amazing. I can't believe you got, And then I did the Reverend, which I didn't really want to do, but she insisted. And she said, kind of sweetly, he's a little older than you, so you have to slow down. He said, the way that you actually convey an old person is to speak very slowly. But it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Hi. I saw a interview of you on television. I think it was NPR, and with Jeffrey, I can't remember his last name, and he was saying that he found the book a little difficult to get started in, and you said you intended that. Mm-hmm. And could you tell us more about why you intended that, and then what you did to make it difficult?
Sure.
To get into?
I didn't. Yeah, and actually, that's such a common reaction. You do enough of these, and here's what it is: people read to page 28, and then they throw it across the room, and then some of them leave it there, and some of them pick it up again, and even I think it's I didn't really intend that, but I didn't. I wanted there to be. I wanted the book to teach you how to read it. And I edited it a lot. There were easier versions and there were harder versions. And my thought was, if I can make a sort of medium-sized doorway for you to go through, then the last third should open way up. Because the way it's laid out on the page is a pain at first, and it's kind of mystifying. But I think people say that by the end, you've learned to read it that way, and you're going pretty fast, and things are happening that wouldn't happen in a more conventional book. So I would never try to, my thing is never make a book difficult for the sake of making it difficult. But if you need to come in at a certain level to make it pay off, then that's an honorable choice. But not experimenting for experiment's sake, but only to heighten the emotional experience of the book. So I appreciate you sticking with it if you did, and if you didn't, it's cool. As long as you paid for it. Also, I have found that if you have trouble with the book and you buy an additional 4 copies, it doesn't change anything. But sorry. Yeah.
Hi, this weekend you are doing a talk in Boston with an author, Being Mortal.
Yeah, Atul Gawande.
Atul Gawande.
Right.
His talk is about living in the brevity and finding out your purpose and hopefully expectations. And your book has some of the immortalities of life and these little purgatories that we're in. I'm curious how you're preparing this weekend for this really interesting talk.
Yeah, I'm just rereading the book, which is wonderful. And I think what I loved about writing this book was that, okay, in the Buddhist tradition that I practice in, they say that a couple things. One, if you want to know what your death is going to be like, look at your mind right now, which is terrifying. And in addition, they say that, in this life, the mind is as neurotic and energetic as it is, it's tamped down by the physicality of being in your body. And when you die, they say, if you think of the mind as a wild horse tied to a pole, when you die, somebody cuts the rope. So your mind gets kind of supersized and starts hallucinating, and of course it does it in the flavor of your thinking right now. So if you're a stingy person, even a little bit theoretically, that gets supersized and you become this stingy, hungry ghost. Not exactly reassuring if you're me. But on the other hand, it argues that you could work with your mind in this life and maybe get it together somehow. So I think I'll be talking about that, the idea that we don't know, of course, what happens after death, but it would be weird if it was totally unrelated to what happened in this life. So if you can, work with your mind now, maybe it would be better then. That's the theory anyway, so I don't know. Yeah.
I think finish up with these 3 questions, then we'll sign some books. Is that okay?
Okay, sure, yeah. I don't know who's first.
I have a couple of questions, and they're more specific.
Sure.
The iron fence, the people within the cemetery can't leave because of the iron
Right.
fence. But the people who were buried in the potter's field, they can come and go as they like.
Right.
Is that something to do with their social standing, or?
Because we're in such a small, intimate gathering, I can say this. A lot of what I find is you're making a world in fiction that has to do a lot with what you need for the story to work. So I found early on that it was a more meaningful story for me if they couldn't get out of the graveyard. So then you kind of invent things to make that true. You world build. And then at some point, it produces dividends, and you named it exactly, which is these people who are so proud of being buried in the all-white, affluent cemetery are trapped by it, and they can't get out. But the people who are in the potter's field can come and go as they like. So that's part of it. But throughout the book, there were these weird things, like, for example, the fact that in this world, kids, it's very dangerous for kids in this world. Why? Because I needed it to be. If the story was Willie's there and it's totally cool, you lose a little drama. So then, now first you feel like a faker, you're making up something. But what I've learned is you go ahead and honor the internal tension of the story. So let me make it so that that's the rule of that universe. Kids in this place suffer terribly. The way you do that is you make a precedent. It's that girl called Miss Trainer.
Yes.
So then the reader kind of believes it. Now, the beautiful thing is, if you do that just for mechanical reasons, you find that you get thematic payoff. In this case, someone says, why in the world would you make an afterlife where a kid can suffer horribly for no reason? I'm like, yeah, look around, So in other words, this hell, or this purgatory realm, isn't actually all that much more fair than this world. And so throughout the book, I was kind of guided by the principle that it would be pretty strange if the afterlife is exactly what we expect. Have you read the Stanley Elkin story, The Conventional Wisdom? Do you know that? It's a masterpiece. But the idea is that everything we've ever heard in church about heaven and hell is true. Completely true. Literally true. So he goes to heaven and there's angels with harps. And it said it looks like a beautiful theme park. And he walks up to St. Peter and he says, I'm so happy to be here. I think I'm going to like it here. And St. Peter says, go to hell. And hell is just like we've heard. It's heat and terrible monsters and sexual violation and everything. And this guy's down there, and we know from the first part of the story, he's a really good guy. Much more responsible than us, you know. And what? So at one point, after thousands of years, he screams out, and God decides, he said, ask a couple of questions. Go ahead. And he says, why am I in hell? What did I do? And God says, I don't know. You didn't honor your mother and your father. And he goes, I did. And he gives you examples. And God says, oh, yeah, but you were adopted. They never told you.
Right.
You know? It's a great story. But,
Can I ask
but you know, this idea that, you know, one of the arrogances that I have personally is I can talk about humility and not understanding life, but really I think I do. But I bet I don't. And I think part of the book was to sort of just maybe lightly remind myself that we actually don't know what's happening next. Yeah.
Is that why the judging of the souls was so, it seemed sort of arbitrary because the angry guy got to go right in?
Right, right. Yeah, because I think there are a lot of angry people who are better people than me, actually.
Right.
You know, I'll tell you that Reverend scene. One of the things that happened to me was there was a time when our kids were little, and I was trying to get in shape, so I was working out and not drinking. And then we went to a 4th of July party, and I had a couple beers. Came home that night, just a little buzz, no problem. Went to the bathroom in the middle of the night, stood at the mirror, and I was just washed over with the most depressing feeling of life not being worth it. And me not being a very good person. I never have had that feeling before or since, and then I passed out. And I hit the bathtub so hard with my head that it woke my wife up 4 rooms away. And then being a South Chicago mutt, I just jumped up, whoa, that was weird, you know. But I often wondered, you know, if that, now again, I don't know the cause and effect. It might have just been that I was short of oxygen, but I thought, if that had been a fatal stroke, would I have gone into the next life in that mindset? And if this thing that the Buddhists say is true, that the mind gets supersized, that would be hell times 10, you know. I have a friend who's a very distinguished Buddhist practitioner, and about 10 years ago, he dropped dead in an airport, near death, but he was dead, and he had the experience of going to heaven. And he came back, and they revived him, actually, and he came back just full of love and optimism. Then a few years later, during a surgery, it happened again, and he went to hell. And he had a completely vivid experience of going to hell. So I maybe as an insurance policy, I kind of try to remind myself that we don't know. We don't know what might happen. So this is a really inspiring talk, isn't it? Yeah. Crowd of 800 leaps off bridge in Kansas City. Author blamed. It would be on Fox for sure.
I just want to say one more thing.
Oh.
Can I just say, Miss Trainer, the manifestation's devastating and beautiful, those descriptions.
She's in heaven now, by the way. Yeah.
This is not necessarily about Lincoln in the Bardo, but I had questions about how you write your characters, because sometimes they're people that I would consider to be really hateable if they actually lived, but the way you characterize them, they become very, I don't know, you care about them. I think of the woman in the 10th of December, the collection that drowns the puppies. That one always stuck with me, because that's somebody you would really hate.
Yeah.
But you empathize with her so much. And like, have you ever had a character you were afraid to put in a story? Or how do you overcome that? Because I think that's really hard to do.
Yeah, I don't really get, it's funny, when I'm writing, I don't really get timid or afraid. I get really locked in on the power of the story. If you know, I have a story called Escape from Spiderhead, and in there's this terrible lab that does sexual experiments, and the logic of the story dictated that it get even worse. And I noticed in that moment that I was like, ho, yes. You know, I don't really have that timidity in the moment. And I think for me, the trick is that you're, as I said earlier, when you're imagining a character who's done something terrible, you're trying to be right inside of her mind and body, and you're trying to pull the reader in there too. And I think the way you do that is by making the best case for what they're going to do. You know, so if somebody does a horrible thing or a bad thing, to them, I don't think it seems horrible. I think even war criminals, when they get up in the morning, they actually think they're virtuous, you know, in a perverse way. Otherwise, the Hollywood version of a bad guy is, yeah, I'm going to dominate the world and, throw all the kittens in the river. But I don't think anyone that I have ever met thinks that way. I just don't think so. So that gives you kind of an into the character. And in the end, I love all of them. Even if they're not good people, I like them. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
If you had no deadline, how do you know when to stop writing on a work?
That is a good question. That's, it's like that old definition of pornography. You know it when you see it. I think actually each writer figures out for herself what it feels like when you've really done it. The way I think is that when you go too far, the work starts getting worse. I sometimes compare it to. You would never do this, but if you were trying to paint the floor of your house, and you wouldn't do that, but let's say you're trying to paint the stage, you'd paint it and you'd start backing towards the door and you'd keep looking to make sure everything was even and you'd touch here, there. Then at some point you'd be in the doorway. And for me, sometimes by that point, the story is so, I feel, so logical, all the stakes are laid out, that you can kind of just step out and do one last little brushstroke like that, But the definition I like of a story ending is stopping without sucking. And the other thing I noticed is that often if you get to the end of a story and you can't make it work, what do? You tend to rev it up lyrically, and then on that strange October day, but usually if the story won't end, it's because the middle isn't good. I did an exercise with my undergrads at Syracuse once where there's that great Vonnegut story called Harrison Bergeron. And I thought, I'll give him that. So I photocopied it, handed it out, went home and read it. And when I got to the end, there was something weird about the ending. It seemed like it ended differently than I thought. So I went and got another anthology, and it turns out this anthology had omitted a page.
Oh.
So I immediately decided it would be a teaching moment. And I went in and said, now you might not notice, but I left the left page. But then the funny thing was, this was a freshman English class. They weren't writers at all. They were from other disciplines. And I said, okay, part of my design was you write the ending. And we read 7 or 8 aloud. Every one of them was wonderful. Some of them were not even that well written or grammatical even, but plot-wise they were perfect. And I thought, why was that? It was because Vonnegut had thrown the bowling pins up in the air so beautifully that everybody knew what was at stake in the story. They knew the 3 or 4 elements that needed to be resolved. The middle was so beautiful that those bowling pins came up, and anybody could catch them on the way down, So I tell my students, don't sweat over the ending, but go back and sweat over the middle, I think, yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for your time. Enjoyed it.
I ended up getting turned off.